Welcome everybody to Deep Drinks Podcast, the deepest podcast on the internet. And today we have a very special guest. I'm always super excited when I can talk to a Christian, especially a Christian that used to be in the same kind of realm or denomination as myself. Erik Manning runs the YouTube channel, the popular YouTube channel, Testify Apologetics. Where he focuses mostly on the reliability of the New Testament, the history of the resurrection of Jesus, the uniqueness of Jesus, and the argument from miracles. Erik is a Pentecostal Christian, and today we'll have an open and hopefully friendly conversation. I'm sure it will be friendly. He's a nice guy. I really enjoyed seeing how Erik engaged with Derek from Myth Vision, so I invited him on. For those who don't know, I was once a Pentecostal youth pastor. I spoke in tongues, felt what I described at the time as the Holy Spirit, and believed in miracles. My opinion of all those things is almost the polar opposite. Therefore, it should be an interesting conversation. Let's get started. Welcome, Erik. Thank you for coming on Deep Drinks Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, David, for having me on. Appreciate it.
So, are you nervous? You're in the lion's den. You're in the realm of the enemy.
I'm in the hot seat. Yeah, what am I going to do? I'm shaking in my socks here.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your channel before we jump into it? Because I'm sure it'll be a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it pretty well. I just mostly talk about like the reliability of the Gospels. I've just always really enjoyed history. Even when I was back in high school, it seems like, of course, I have a neighbor mowing their yard right now, so I hope that doesn't go through the microphone.
That's okay. I can't hear it.
So, but I just was always drawn to history. Even when I was in high school, I was actually a pretty poor student, but I could basically be asleep or halfway stoned and still get an A in history. Not really study. So I just enjoy history. So that's kind of what I talk about with my channel is kind of the text, is the New Testament historically reliable? Different things like that, the focus on the resurrection of Jesus. And then of course the argument for miracles is so entangled because as you know, a lot of people will say you could just never have enough evidence to prove anything based on testimony alone. And so that's basically what I focus on with the channel.
Yeah, it's I really enjoy it. I think you do really well. You have a really good balance between clickbait titles and producing content that lives up to that clickbait. I mean, obviously, it never fully lives up to everything, not just your channel, but everyone's channel. But it captures the attention, and it's not like horrible clickbait. It's not like really misleading.
Yeah.
So.
You gotta clickbait these days,
you gotta. It's part of the game. You got to do it.
Yeah.
That's why I got an image of a retro looking like a retro looking Jesus in the thumbnail of this, because it's kind of like Pentecostal Christianity seems to be like the cool Christianity. It seems to be like it's definitely like up there compared to like Anglicans and Methodists and things like that. It's like the hip Christianity. It's like Hillsong. It's like, you know, it's got vibe to it. So. Yeah,
it depends on your version of it, I guess. Maybe I'm kind of old school. We wear suits to church.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we. It's not we're not the cool, hip Hillsong kind of a church. Actually, I mean, I'm not saying those songs never get played, and it almost has more. Our church music is almost like more. You'd almost thought this is going to sound bad, and I hope this doesn't sound weird, but it's like you walked into more like a black Pentecostal church almost. As far as the flavor of music, you got the B3 organ, just you know, and
right,
that kind of a thing. And so yeah, it's not the Jeans and Hillsong kind of stuff there, but
interesting.
Yeah.
Did you guys do the Appalachians, like the snake handling kind of stuff?
Like yeah, you know, grabbing those rattlers.
Do you really?
No,
Yeah. I don't know that. Hey,
of
man,
course not.
I
No,
talk
no,
to a
no,
lot
no,
of
no,
weird,
no,
I
no,
talk to a
no,
lot of
not
strange
yeah,
belief systems on this
yeah,
podcast.
yeah. No, we might wear suits, but yeah, we're not handling snakes or anything like that. Um, but yeah, no, that's the extreme appellation. I don't know what's
Yeah.
going on there. I've never met one of those people in real life.
No,
I'd like
neither.
to. Yeah.
No, neither. It's it'd be interesting. I just want to quickly shout out. Thank you, Pragmatic Chris, for demolishing that like button, everyone. Captain Dadpool, it's great to see you here. Joshua, it's awesome to see you here. Eddie, Kevin, Apostasy, the amazing Apostasy, and I hope I didn't miss anyone. But it's awesome to see you guys come out. Casey, Randy, that's awesome. Hey everybody. So the first question I've written down so many things I want to talk about, and I'm hoping this conversation can just go naturally where it flows. And I appreciate that you took the time to come on here. I've asked a lot of apologists on, and a lot of the times they don't get back to me, or they just say they're not interested in coming on. I had one person tell me that their leader looked at my channel and told me that they couldn't come on, and this was like a 50-year-old person, and I was like, okay, like, that's interesting. But I hope I can show that we can have a respectful conversation, and even though we have very different belief systems.
Sure.
So I want to ask you firstly is, how did you, before you got interested in apologetics and before you ran your YouTube channel, like, how did you initially start believing in God? Like, what was the catalyst for your faith? Did you grow up religious, or did you how did that happen?
Yes, and then no. So I was raised.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I should mention, what are we
Oh,
drinking?
lemon water, because us Pentecostals, we're big drinkers.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
baby. Got lemon water. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. No, actually, we don't really. I don't have a doctrine against drinking alcohol, and I just personally don't.
Mm,
And that's kind of part of my story. My parents were, well, I don't want to make them look bad, but they kind of had problems with it as I was growing up. And so I just kind of promised myself, like, it's just not something, I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
yeah.
I just, for me, it's just a personal deal, but most people are just fine, whatever. It's just, there's other situations that people have been around. And so, thankfully my
Yeah.
dad has been sober for several years now. So that's awesome. But yeah,
That's
I was
great.
raised Catholic. And I was like, had my first communion in the Catholic Church. My parents were kind of like Catholic, but only, I would say, nominally so.
Mhm.
And my dad taught at like a Catholic school. We lived near our grandparents. We attended church all together as a family. But once my dad got a job in the St. Louis area, and we moved there from Michigan to St. Louis, Missouri, we stopped pretty much going to church, maybe Christmas, maybe Easter, and that's about it. And so as I became a teenager, I started having, questions and doubts about God. I just kind of thought the whole evolutionary story was a better explanation for how people got here. And then, of course, there was a problem of pain and suffering. I'd grown up in a home that wasn't necessarily super to get had everything together, and a lot of my friends kind of were from the same situation. I'll just kind of put it real mildly, and just kind of ran around with a bit of a somewhat of a wild crowd, kind of getting myself into trouble doing different things like that. And I just looked around and saw a lot of brokenness. I lived in the St. Louis area. Like I said, we had flooding that was just devastating to the whole city. My mom had cancer when I
Ooh.
was a teenager. And I just put all of these things together, and I'm like, I'm suffering. My family's suffering. My friends are suffering. There's floods, there's hurricanes and earthquakes and all kinds of craziness. It seems like the naturalistic kind of explanation of how we got here. This is the kind of world we would expect if there is no God, is basically what I came to think. And so I was an atheist for my teenage years. I mean, I'm not talking about like I'm reading Graham Oppie and and reading, like the sophisticated atheist or anything, or even I didn't even know. This is before the days of, even Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens
Yeah.
and all that popularized atheism that was out there. I just kind of came to that conclusion just by looking around at the world. And I spent about 2 years of my life that way. just as an atheist, I'd kind of go back and forth from atheism to agnosticism. I thought, well, maybe it's possible that there's a God, but I don't think that it's really knowable. And I just went back and forth with that. I think in the middle of that, I kind of became dissatisfied with some of the answers. And again, this is not deep philosophical stuff here. So I'm not trying to like portray myself as like a Lee Strobel's kind of story here, where I really studied the evidence hard and then came to believe that Christianity was true or anything else like that. I just kind of thought, well, I understand that the world is a bit of a mess and there is evil. But if there is like maybe distance epistemically between me and God, that he obviously knows a whole lot more than I do, then it is at least possible that there's reasons for this that are just beyond my understanding. And I also kind of thought, well, even though origins could be probably explained by evolution or different things like that, it sure seems like just the origination of the universe is kind of hard to explain. Some of the beauty of it, some of the apparent design of it. Again, I'm not saying anything super sophisticated because I didn't know any of the sophisticated arguments. I didn't know what a Kalam cosmological or teleological argument was. And so I thought, well, maybe there is a God. But if there is a God, maybe deism is probably the closest thing to that picture, because he seems like he's just standing far, far away. But I thought, if there is a God, a deistic God doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because you would think he would at least want to kind of like say hello. He would at least want to communicate something at some point, like just a God who just kind of starts the world winds it up like a clock and then just lets it run. Just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And so there probably would be some kind of a revelation if there was God. And so I didn't really want Christianity to be true, to be totally honest. I kind of thought Christianity was kind of lame. The people that I knew that were Christians, they felt like very stiff and rigid and fuddy-duddy. I had some neighbors that were just, their dad was like the biggest hypocrite. I'd go over to their house and hang out with them. They'd go to church on Sunday, and then we'd get into his pornographic magazines that he hid in his sock drawer, and it's like, yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot of power changing this guy's life. And so I didn't want Christianity to be true because of what I saw out of it. And just the way my dad was even kind of mistreated at his job. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but at any rate, I began to study different religions. I looked at Islam briefly. Immediately, I was like, yeah, this isn't it. And so I thought, well, I'll just read the Bible. So I dug up the Bible that I was given at my confirmation as a Catholic, and I just read it for months and months on end. I'd come home from school, I'd maybe read it for half an hour, and then I'd go about and do the same normal kind of crazy things that I normally would do. But I was at least kind of open, and I'd read the Gospels, and I thought, well, these stories are strange, because like I love the Sermon on the Mount and these ethics that Jesus is bringing, and he seems like a very compelling character. Then sometimes he kind of looks like a jerk, to be honest. And then sometimes he's speaking to winds and waves, and he's healing the sick, and that doesn't seem like that could possibly even be real. And so I kind of had that anti-miracle argument in the back of my head kind of running there, even though, again, I didn't know what it was. But there was more of an openness as I continued to read, I suppose. And I kind of thought, well, these Gospels sure seem to be presenting themselves as reportage. I don't think that they're trying to present a myth. And then I was reading the First John, and it talked about, we touched him, we handled him, we saw him, that kind of thing. I'm just paraphrasing the first bit of First John. And then as I kept reading, I got to the second chapter of John, and it was something about
First John or John?
First John, the epistle.
Yeah, that's my favorite book.
Yeah. And so as I was reading that book, it said, don't love the world, the things of the world, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life, which is, I'm a teenager, and that's kind of what I felt like I was going for, just whatever I felt like kind of doing. I'm not saying I didn't have any ethics or morals, but and so I just saw that I do love the world. And it said that anybody who loves the world is going to perish, but the person who does the will of God lives forever. And at that particular point, and people can do with this whatever they will. I'm not saying this is a a very evidentially compelling religious experience that people should believe just because I'm saying it. I'm just saying what happened to me. It seemed as if there was another person who just stepped into the room with me. And I just sensed this overwhelming sense of what Christians would just call as conviction. I felt like I couldn't really explain the experience that I was undergoing. And the next thing I knew, I just found myself on my knees praying God to save me. And, I had the whole overwhelming sense of peace and burden lifted off my shoulder, felt kind of high in that fresh conversion bubble for several weeks. Just kind of saw people through new eyes, through kind of more of a loving eyes, where before the people at school would just annoy me to death. And it just kind of changed my life. And it's just kind of been changed from there. So no deep apologetics, none of that kind of stuff, to be completely honest, even though I like apologetics. But I think there was some of that apologetic kind of reasoning, supposedly, I guess, in the background. And on both sides. I mean, even as an atheist, I was reasoning philosophically and in some sense with the whole problem of evil and whatnot. So I know it was a bit long-winded. Hopefully that wasn't more than you were asking for.
It was good. Yeah. No, I appreciate you being honest. I had a very similar experience with myself. I went to a youth group. I didn't really want to I was a Christian, grew up a Christian, and I got involved in the church. But then when I moved up with my dad, I kind of moved away from all of that. My dad has a history of alcohol abuse as well, and he was sober at the time. So I went to this he's still sober now, which is awesome. But I went to this youth group, and I had this experience where I didn't want to go up the front for prayer because I just felt like I was like, God, I'll get right with you when I'm 40 or when I'm 50. And then all the youth that invited me, they came over to me and just prayed for me, kind of like non-consensually. But at the time, I appreciated it. And I remember just looking down eventually at a puddle of tears. They were prophesying things over me I thought they couldn't know. And yeah, for the next like 6 or 7 weeks, I was just totally like, well, it wasn't even 6 or 7 weeks. It was more than that. But for like a weekend, I felt a little bit drunk or a little bit euphoric, like a little bit different. And my friends at school and then the bullies at school started calling me Captain Christian, and I claimed it like a title, and I would run Bible studies at school, and I was really on fire. And then a few years later, I became the youth pastor of that youth group. When I just gave it my all. I obviously have a different perspective of all that now. How do you see your experience in that? Has it changed at all from what you first experienced? Like when you first experienced it, you might have had an opinion of it, but has it changed at all since then?
I mean, I think it was genuine. And I kind of take Richard Swinburne's kind of approach of like, if this is what you believe you're perceiving and you don't have an undercutting defeater to say against it otherwise. And I look, it's not that I don't look for defeaters or anything like that. That's what my channel is kind of focused on. But yeah, I just don't feel like I have any reason to necessarily doubt that it was genuine. I've had other experiences with, like, I don't think that my experience, like I said, I'm not using it as you should become a Christian because of my story. I don't think it's an evidentially compelling kind of religious experience. I have had other experiences before where it was kind of like, okay, that seemed a little more on the supernatural side of things. That one's a little more difficult to explain. But yeah, so I guess I look at it for me as like, I could understand how somebody in your shoes would just be like, people have those experiences. People have those experiences in other religions. Mormons could claim a similar experience or something like that. And so I think if that's all I had, if that's all I had, and there wasn't other evidence for Christianity and other like defeating kind of objections came against it, then I could see one rationally justifying that what they experienced wasn't real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you if we could go down that route of analyzing it. If I could push back a little bit on how I kind of see that now versus. Sure. Are you comfortable doing that? Talking a little bit about those. Yeah,
I don't care.
Okay. Obviously these things are very personal things, and so I try and be respectful. But so how, like, if and you mentioned it just there, but my question would have been, if someone was to have the exact same experiences that you had, but for another religion, would that be evidence of their religion?
No, I mean, I would think it would be like weak evidence at best. So if a
Okay.
Mormon told me I prayed over the Book of Mormon and I sensed this overwhelming, burning in the bosom or whatever the I don't know if it's Second Nephi that's what it says or something like that. I wouldn't
Mm.
necessarily take that as evidence, and I don't think an unbeliever should really take that as strong evidence. I do think there are such things as like evidentially compelling religious experiences. I'm trying to remember the name of the philosopher who's published on it. It's on a friend of mine channel, Jordan Hampton. I'll have to. It'll come back to me. I'll bring it up maybe later. But he's published different ones where people will have like a kind of a more of a compelling type of experience, or it would be in line with maybe modern day miracles or,
Yeah.
or something like that. It's maybe like a healing or something like that. I would say that's far more compelling than just I sensed the presence of God or the peace of God or something like that. So I'll give you one example. I'm not going to give it from my own life, but like there
Mhm.
is a pastor. It's a pretty well-known story. You can look it up on the news. The man's name was Pastor Deeb, Deeb, and he was in Beirut, Lebanon. Downtown close to where that giant explosion was. I don't know if you remember that from the news, but it just completely like destroyed a
Yeah.
huge part of downtown. And if I remember correctly, he owns like his church runs like I don't know if it's like a daycare, some sort of child care program or something like that. He has a bunch of employees. And the day of the explosion, he was praying and he felt extremely unsettled, very, very, very unsettled. And he didn't know why. He didn't know what was going on. And you like I said, you can look up a story, Pastor Deeb, Deeb, um, Beirut, and it'll come up. And he just told everybody go home. Like he was
Hmm.
forceful about it. People were pushing back on it. Like, what are you talking about? You're acting really strange. And he's like, just go home, close everything down. They're like, we're making food, we're preparing all this stuff. He's like, I don't care, go home. Well, then that explosion happened. Now, of course, that raises other questions about the problem of evil. Like, why isn't God talking to everybody and warning them about that? And I do
Mm.
understand that. But there is less evil, at least in the world, if he's warning somebody who at least is trying to have their spiritual antenna up, so to speak, relate to God, be listening to him, and being able to warn a whole flock of people working at his church and children, sending them home for the day. And so I find that to be at least moves the needle towards theism, at least somewhat,
Hmm.
um, versus like it's certainly not evidence against it. And so, again, unless you want to bring the problem of evil and hey, why not more? Why did God let the explosion happen to begin with? And again, I could kind of understand some of that, but those are the kind of stories that I would, if I was to use that as evidence, religious experience as evidence, I would use more stories like that. Not just one. I would want to bring in multiple to build a case, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
of course. Yeah. Is so just going back to your experience, and we'll swing around to this other experience. If you have this experience, and for you it's evidence, but but you say it would be weak evidence for somebody else, for like if someone else had the same experience. I mean, hypothetically, we can't really know if they're telling us the truth when they tell us these stories. Like, but let's say hypothetically we could somehow tell that they had a similar experience praying to Krishna or Arjuna or Buddha or other, and I take it you don't consider Mormons Christians.
Wouldn't call them orthodox. I would say
Yeah,
they're heretical. Yeah,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
for sure.
So if like so it would be weak evidence. Would it be weak evidence for you then, or is it something?
Well, I think for the person who's experiencing it, it might not be weak evidence. But
Okay.
I think if that's all you have is your religious experience, and then you come up against these defeaters, say the problem of evil, like what we've kind of brought up a
Mm,
little bit, or if you're a Christian, what about contradictions or historical errors in the Gospels or something to that effect? Well, then I think in order to be maintain being rational, I don't take the approach of like Reformed epistemology. Um,
mm,
and so I think that, okay, we need to find out how do we answer these objections. Now, I'm not saying you have to answer every single objection in order to your worldview to be coherent. You're not going to be able to, everybody's worldview has sticking points that they can't necessarily answer.
Mhm.
But I do think that you should have more going for your view than against it. So you would want to look at, say, the historical reliability of the Gospels, which is what my channel is all about. You might want to look at how Christians have addressed the problem of evil. You may need to have arguments for why you think God exists.
I
It-
I think I understand. I think I understand that. Like it's a more of a cumulative approach.
sure.
Like it's like, yeah, but just in just like analyzing the evidence one at a time. Like the
Hmm.
evidence, if we were to look at the evidence and you were to say it's weak evidence for other religions, but not weak evidence for you, um,
Or the person
uh,
experiencing it, even in
or
that
the
religion.
person experiencing it. Yeah, the person experience. So would it be? So would it be evidence of like the Buddha working in someone's life, or Krishna or something? Say you believe in a theistic Buddha, but or like some other god. Like I've got friends who I've got Muslim friends who, when we first became friends, it's because I reached out to them and I saw their video editing was amazing, and I said, hey, your video editing is amazing, you got a good future ahead of you. I thought they were like 16 and I was just giving some encouragement to like a kid. Turns out they're like 26. But anyway, that's another story. And so we ended up becoming really good friends. But but I said, what did you think when you first had this? She was wearing a hijab, and I said, what do you think when you first had this like random message you on your YouTube channel? And they said, and she said, I thought you were a messenger from Allah. And she said that she attributed my encouragement to Allah. Um, what would you? I mean, that's just someone encouraging someone. But what would you say to someone who felt the presence of, or felt like a warming presence, or a overwhelming feeling of joy, or awe or wonder with Allah or another god? Um,
Sure. Again, I would say that with I
Without going
think,
to the cumulative evidence,
yeah,
just by
yeah,
itself.
yeah. I would
Yeah.
say, I mean, it's. I would say that they're rational, at least in
Hmm.
thinking that that's what they experienced. I think that um, God can kind of work even in spite of the way people think. And I
Hmm.
think that's when we just have to go also look at the objective evidence. It's like, for example, there are people who argue for the resurrection of Jesus, right? And they'll
Hmm.
use an approach that's completely based on 1 Corinthians 15.
Hmm.
And it's like the minimal facts approach. And they'll say, okay, well, the disciples believe they saw Jesus, and Paul believed that he saw Jesus, and they converted. And so the best explanation is that Jesus rose again from the dead. And it's kind of like, well, what did they experience? What was their experience like? I don't know if they're rational in order to justify that particular experience. It might have been real for them and they were sincere in believing it, but we need to know the details of their testimony in order to know that they're rational. And so I think when it comes to any kind of religious experience, miracle story, or any kind of supernatural story, for the lack of a better terms, like the devil is in the details. And so we need to
Hmm.
know some of the details of what was experienced. And if the details were just something fuzzy, like I had a warm feeling, I had some kind of an epiphany or something like that, then I can understand. Now, I think that my experience is consistent on the Christian worldview because there is such a person as the Holy Spirit. He does say that he'll bear witness with your spirit that we're the children of God. It does says that he'll send the Holy Spirit to live with you and dwell in you and all of these different things. And so I think it's consistent. But again, I don't take that as evidence. And I don't think that even the disciples were necessarily, they weren't saying, hey, look at my experience necessarily in and of itself. I mean, even in the book of Acts, like Paul does talk about his vision. But when he talks about his vision in the book of Acts, he's talking about all of the multi-sensory details that are happening,
Hmm.
people hearing a voice and not understanding, and his, blindness for several days, Aeneas healing him and different things like that. Um, and or the disciples, he references like, hey, these people ate and drank in his presence and this, that, and the other. And so I think you're going to need sturdier details for any kind of miracle story in order to know if somebody is rational or justified. And so, yeah, and that's totally fine. I think that's part of any kind of evidential filter that we should put through any claim is this a vague experience or is there something more concrete here? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, so that's where I landed on that for myself is I realized that other religions have personal experiences as well. In
Mm,
fact, a family member had one. with another religion, and that I at the time thought, ha, those demons are getting very clever. They're like starting to emulate exactly what we're experiencing at church. I thought that for a while. A relative, they went to a prayer meeting, but it was like a Tibetan prayer meeting with a very Eastern kind of religious thought, and they ended up all like, I don't know, I think it was like they all fell over laughing, and they were hysterical for a while, and she came home and just like was talking about like this experience, like exactly how I talked about youth group and youth camp. And I remember thinking, oh, there must be like demons and stuff. So for me, I kind of looked at that and thought, for myself, and this is part of my deconversion experience, is deconstructing experiences. I looked at that and said, if that's not evidence for them, like if I don't think that evidence is valid for that belief system, then I can't make it valid for my belief system. Like I think it's unfair to do that. I'm not denying that I had experiences. I definitely had some experiences. But I mean, there are people who have experiences. There are millions of people who have experiences with alien abductions, yet I don't think they're actually been abducted by aliens.
Sure. I mean, I think there's an atheist philosopher by the name of Susan Blackmore who says that she's had what she believes she would describe as religious experiences. And so, yeah, I understand that totally. This is why I'm an evidentialist. And so, like I said, I understand that it can be justifying for that particular person, but I don't think a Christian should just stay and live off of their personal experience. I think they need to have their faith more rooted in some sort of objective evidence through history and different things like that.
That's an exciting thing to talk about. We have a super chat from Nitty. Erik is at least cool with memes and being nice when, I'm not always nice. # working on it. That's awesome, Nitty. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks,
and I did really appreciate the way you spoke with Derek. I think Derek was in the lines at that time. Was it like 3 Christians and just Derek just chilling there, or the 2 Christians? I can't remember.
There was 3 of us. Yeah.
Yeah. But that was a cool conversation. I like to see conversations across the belief realm. And thank you, Nitty, for the super chat. Super appreciate that. So if we have those personal testimonies, and then you were kind of talking about, and we can get into the historicity a little bit as well, but you're talking about like other testimonies, so like miracles.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, the same issue comes about. Like the same issue, like we have, you have that story of the person in Beirut who had this intuition that told him send all the kids home. Like I could just throw the same question, like if that happened of another religion, would that be evidence of that religion? Like
I mean, I do know that people like will say this kind of like,
people are going to clip this and make you look
yeah, no, it's fine. People will bring this up as a hypothetical, but
yeah,
this is like, what about miracles in other religions? And I'm just kind of like, okay, so what about them? And so I have no problem looking at other miracles in a case by case basis, but for like a hypothetical situation, like I don't really know. I see way more miracles in a Christian context, which I mean, it could make sense even from a naturalistic standpoint. They expect miracles. The whole religion is based on miracles, whereas Islam, even Allah, was just kind of like, hey, guys, I'm just a warder, that you only get until later into the hadiths that does, Muhammad start really doing the fun stuff hundreds of years later. And so I totally get that objection. I just like, you're going to have to give me like specifics, and then we can look at the specifics. And I think when we do look at specific miracle claims, I think we can run them through like a couple of like non-religious, like religiously neutral filters, and see if they are plausible or not. And
yeah,
so
we could do that.
Yeah. And so it's kind of like, and even those, like, I'm not even saying that they didn't happen. I'm just saying that if we don't want to go herring after every miracle claim, or we'd just be wasting our time. But if some can go through like a religiously neutral filter, then I think, okay, well, let's investigate that. Let's see where that takes us, rather than just doing like David Hume does, where it's just like, well, the prior probability is just so low and people lie and are mistaken all the time, so let's just run with that. I'm saying no. Let's look at the evidence, but let's just use some reasonable criteria.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about Hume as well. Daddy Hume, I call him. He's one of my favorite philosophers. Funny story. So before I was before, and maybe you could read into, maybe you can clip me if you believe in spiritual stuff or and stuff. But when I was in Scotland, I was considered myself a Christian still, but I was definitely questioning my faith and like trying to expand my worldview. And we went on this tour in Edinburgh, and we rubbed this toe of this statue, which was like the tradition at the time. And I rubbed this toe, and apparently you're meant to get the philosophical, you get the philosophical powers of if you rub his big toe. It was the statue of David Hume. I didn't know who it was. Years later, I'm like an atheist, and I'm like, I love David Hume, blah blah blah. And I'm like looking at statues of David Hume, and I'm like, I recognize that statue. I go back through our old photos. I'm like, that's the statue of the toe that we rubbed in Scotland. I must have got the spiritual. Don't do it. Don't do it, Erik. You become an atheist.
You touched the hem of his garment, and virtue has flowed out of him, and skepticism ran through you. Yeah. I think I know which statue you're referring to, because when you look up Hume, like on Canva or something, it's one of the ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Just so everyone, I'm trying to keep really invested in this conversation, because it's unlike most conversations, it's very challenging, because so I'm missing a little bit of the comments. So but I appreciate your comments. So but if you really want a question answered, or if you want a question answered, you can at Deep Drinks, because then it'll pop up and make it easier for me to see. But if you really want a question answered, the only way is super chat. It's the only way I can keep these conversations going, and make sure that it's the best way to support this channel as well, and the best way to get your question answered. But I'll try and get to them if you go at Deep Drinks. And Anthony, I think I've tagged your comment to ask later. So but thank you again for all the comments. I really appreciate it. So when it comes to like other religions and analyzing like a miracle, we could go through some miracles now, but I feel like if I was to tell you like the perfect miracle for like some other religion, I don't know if you'd it wouldn't. Once again, it's a cumulative case for you, right? It's like you wouldn't accept that as evidence for that religion.
I don't know. I mean, it just depends. I think we should have an open mind. I don't think Christians should just be like close ourselves off to other evidence. I'll give you an example. I'm a Protestant, obviously, Pentecostal. It's a Protestant denomination. But I will say that investigating, and this might get some of my Protestant friends upset with me, investigating some of the claims about the miracles happening at Lourdes. Okay, that's a Catholic context. Lourdes, France. Yeah. And so the Catholic Church does use some pretty stringent criteria before they approve any kind of like miracle. And I know I understand it's still a Christian context technically, because I'm not saying Catholics are not Christians. That would be stupid. Some people go that far. I definitely absolutely do not. But yeah, like some of those miracles are pretty well evidenced, in my opinion. Some are definitely not. Like people ask me all the time, well, what do you think about like, say, Marian apparitions? Well, some are interesting. Some are a little bit on the vague side of things. And some just don't move the needle for me whatsoever. And so it's not like I'm like completely closed off to miracles in different belief systems. Catholicism, in my view, stream and are very, very different, and that would require an extreme change on my end. Maybe not as extreme to going from like Christianity to Islam or something like that, but I'm just saying, like, I don't think that the Christian has to be closed off to that kind of evidence. It's just show it to us. Let us know where it is. I'm looking, and I just haven't seen it yet. There's hypotheticals that get thrown at me, but never anything concrete.
What about I mean, a famous case in Mormonism is the golden plates. We have, I think it's 12 people saw the golden plates, and 4 of them saw the angel Moroni or Joseph Smith give or receive or something. They saw the angel there in the room taking or giving the old golden plates. And even when they left the Mormon church, they wrote affidavits swearing that they saw what they saw.
Yeah.
How would you?
They did. Yeah, with that particular meeting, if you actually look into the history of it, it's very interesting. Joseph was basically like, hey, we have this appointment with the angel. I mean, it's a setup. There's kind of an expectation that something is already happening. We don't know anything about the contents of the actual plates other than what Joseph Smith reportedly translated, which the more details we get about that information, he was using a seer stone and basically looking at a rock and a hat. And
Oh
it's
yeah, it's
like
silly.
word for word King James, and there's all kinds of silliness there. We don't know what they saw. Okay, so they did say that they saw something. And this is a good question. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Bart Ehrman brought this up in his debate with Justin
That's
Bass
how
on
I.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Mm.
And I thought Justin,
By the way, can I
unfortunately,
just
didn't
say,
do it. Go ahead.
yeah, he didn't do a very good. You have to, yeah, okay. Like I watched that and I was like, I was gonna make a video of like the most dishonest apologist I've ever seen, like because it was like almost Ken Ham levels of like ridiculousness.
I'm working on a video over it right now, and Bart ate him for lunch and spit him out.
Yeah.
The only thing that he did poorly on is he's like, well, he did the Hume thing, and I'm like, no, like that's no good. But everything else, I didn't think Bass did very well, and I don't know. I'm working on a video on it. It's just taken longer than I had anticipated. But
Yeah.
no, we don't know details. Like what was the experience like with the angels? Did they touch him? Did they eat with him? Did the angel eat food in front of him, like we read about in the Gospels or different things like that? We only know that they said that they saw something, but we don't know any details for what they saw. So anytime we have a vague miracle report with lacking details, then I think we're rational to at best be agnostic about it and just say, I don't really know about that. That's where I'm at with a lot of these Marian apparitions. It's just like, it's a little vague, or that's a little weird. I can't just completely dismiss it. But at the same time, like there's not a lot of real concrete details. There's people getting healed at Lourdes. So that makes me think something's going on, but that's about it.
Yeah, but there's like, I mean, if you look at the Lord's thing, and just so I have it here. I might as well pop it up. There's this place in let me just share this tab. So there's this place in France, and they have like a miracle healing pool or something near this Mary, and millions of people flock here per year, I think it is. But if you run the numbers, like this is what I've heard, if you run the numbers on like the amount of people who go and the amount of people who have the church say that it's like a miracle. If you run the numbers, it fits almost perfectly with what you'd expect from spontaneous remission of diseases like cancer.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you in some sense there. With a lot of them, like the numbers are crazy, right? And I think anything with miracles, you're not going to expect them to just pop up all the time everywhere. Okay, the whole one big purpose of miracles, besides just helping a person, is that they can serve as a sign, right? And so they're supposed to, in the backdrop of normal nature, they're supposed to deviate in order to get our attention, right? So if they're happening all the time, people could just say, I do understand the natural remission kind of objection. The Catholic Church, because of the charges of superstition that they were from Protestants and others were just like, y'all are just making stuff up. They do have a pretty strict criteria called the Lambertine. I almost said Lamborghini criteria. That would be exciting. Lambertini criteria, which talks about that the disease has to be very serious. It has to be medically impossible to cure. The disease has to be instant, complete, and that there can't be like treatment that was needed afterwards or anything else like that. And it can't be progressively worse. I'm probably messing some of this stuff up. But there's several criteria that they run through, and they run through lots of different doctors and different things. The most recent one, I just watched the story on it. It was an older woman. She had some, I can't remember, what was it, Lord's Healing 70th Miracle. What is her name? Forgive me. Sister Bernadette Moreau. Her story was actually on 60 Minutes, and people can look it up if they want to. I'm not going to go through all of it. They can just kind of search it out. her situation, she was wheelchair bound, fully disabled since 1980. She was on morphine. She felt like a surge of something going through her body. And then she could move. She didn't need the medication anymore. She didn't need the wheelchair anymore. She didn't need the braces anymore. She was looked at by like 60 different doctors. And so it's kind of ridiculous. And so people are welcome to look at that kind of story. I do understand where you're coming from, though, because tons of people flock there and very few people do have that. So I will say that pushback does have at least some force with me. But there are at least 70 cases that have been officially recognized by the church that have gone through this criteria. And they're surprisingly rigorous, probably more rigorous than some of your audience might think of what they accept. There's a lot of people that have what I would say, oh, that's probably a miracle. And they're like, we're not going to publish that one. It's not evidentially compelling enough. We don't want to.
Well, yeah, and that makes sense. Like, it's their bread and butter. Like, that's what that whole place is for. But and we can get into Hume, but I want to bring up some other examples.
Sure.
So we've got Mormonism, which I don't know if that's a pejorative, but we got the Mormon faith, where and with the golden plates and the angel, and it seems like the only thing you can kind of say is like kind of point to the vagueness of the but these people swore an affidavit. They wrote an affidavit even after they left the church, saying that what they saw is what they saw.
Well, sure, and that's why I would think like a minimal facts argument for the resurrection is weak. Paul and the disciples really thought they saw Jesus. Okay, they did. We can grant that as a skeptic. You could say, sure, they were sincere. Maybe they really think they saw something, but I don't know what they saw. What was the experience like?
Okay.
My argument is a little bit different. I'm arguing like, hey, these claims that the disciples that are written in the Gospels go back to what the disciples made, that they spent 40 days with him, they ate with him, they talked to him, they touched him. It was multi-sensory, extended across time kind of details. So that's a little bit different than a brief visitation of an angel that was with no explicit details about golden plates that suddenly apparently disappeared. That somebody
that would be evidence, wouldn't it? That would be that they disappear. That's like the point. Like, that's
right. I'm saying that it's very weak, and so therefore it's not worthy of investigation. I'm not even saying like
what do you think they saw?
I don't know what they saw. I'm saying that it's not worth my time investigating because there's no details. This Bernadette person that I'm bringing up, even though I'm a non-Catholic, to me is worth investigating because there's a lot of evidence with doctors and research and what happened. So there's kind of a parity here. Does that make sense?
Yeah. With the Mormon situation, it seems for me, and I'm just trying to give you my reasoning at the end of each little section, but I see a lot of what the Mormons believe to be, and I hope this isn't offensive to any Mormons out there, but very silly. With Native Americans being cursed by God with the red skin and all that stuff, and like just the history, Casey Randy said the plates were reformed Egyptian, just things like that. Where you're like, okay, this is a bit silly, and that kind of that makes it harder for me to believe that even if there was this story of an angel, it makes me harder to believe the cumulative case because of the silliness of it. And that's actually how I feel a little bit about Christianity and about especially the atonement for sin and the ideas behind Jesus sacrificing himself to serve as like a loophole for rules that he created that he can't circumvent. Like for me, I take a cumulative case of Christianity, and I think the reason apologetics have a job in the first place is because a lot of it you have to make sense. Like a lot of it is very hard for the 21st century person who understands evolution, understands Big Bang cosmology to look at and go, okay, how do we reinterpret Genesis 1? Like, how do we reinterpret the slavery passages? How do we reinterpret like, so for me, I kind of do the same thing that you're doing, but I extend it out to Christianity. Well, not the same thing you're doing, sorry. The thing that I'm doing with Mormonism, I do to Christianity.
Yeah, no, I would say that lowers the prior probability of Christianity being true in the sense of like, okay, what do we make of the slavery passages or um, uh, evolution or different things like that, and how do we reinterpret Genesis? I mean, I think there's always been a variety of different ways that people have interpreted Genesis. I mean, even Augustine was like, no, like it's not 6 days. God just created it all at once, you know. And then there's been other views, like it's young Earth creationism has never really been a dominant view until it really kind of stems out of what's the Seventh Day Adventism, is where it really kind of took Christianity by storm, unfortunately. But it's not really been always the dominant view of the church. I think Luther held to young Earth creationism, but it's not always been a dominant view. So yeah, but I do understand what you're saying. Those considerations do lower the prior when you see like maybe moral atrocities or scientific conundrums or whatever. And so then, yeah, you're going to need good evidence for Christianity in the posterior to overcome any sort of like lower prior for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'll give you one more miracle example, and I've got a few here, but I want to kind of touch on some other things before we finish.
Sure.
But we still have people alive today that you could go talk to who claim to have been resurrected from the dead by Sathya Sai Baba, or at least be related to him, related to the people who were resurrected by him or saw miracles by him. Again, when Sathya Sai Baba died, do you know who that is, by the way?
I sure do.
Yeah, he had a lot of like clearly conning people, not conning people, but clearly like he had a bunch of like watches in his like.
Yeah. I have a video where I play a clip of him manifesting a little watch, and it's basically he's doing the thing that your grandpa did, you know, he's pulling a quarter out from behind your ear, you know.
Yeah. Again, silly. But people believed it. There's a million people who followed him. And this is a testimony. I won't read the whole thing. Essentially, Radha Krishna died. I'll just skip stuff. Died, the death rattle, blah, 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 blah. On the morning of the third day, his body was more ever like a corpse, dark, cold, quite stiff, and beginning to smell. Other people came to see and sympathize with Mrs. Radha Krishna, that she should have a corpse removed from the ashram, but she replied, "Not unless Swami," this is Sathya Sai Baba, orders it. So even some went to the Baba and suggested that as the man was dead and the body starting to smelling and decomposition, it would either be sent back to Kapam or cremated in Puttaparthi. Swami replied, "We'll see. We'll skip downstairs." We'll just continue. When Mrs. Radhakrishna went upstairs again to tell Baba what people were saying to her and asked him what she must do, he answered, "Do not listen to them. Yeah, and have no fear. I am here." Then he said, he will come down soon to see her husband. She went downstairs again and waited with her daughter and her son-in-law by her body. The minutes dragged by, an hour passed, but Swami did not come. Then they were beginning to despair entirely. The door opened, and there stood Baba in red robe, copious fair and shining smile. It was then 2:30 in the afternoon of the third day. Mrs. Radhakrishna went towards Baba and burst into tears. Vijaya too had been crying. Then they were like Martha and Mary, the sisters of Lazarus, weeping before their Lord, who they thought came too late. Gently, Baba asked the tearful woman and sorrowful son-in-law to leave the room. As they left, the door was closed behind them. They did not know, no man knew what happened in that room where they were, only Baba and the dead man. After a few minutes, Baba opened the door and beckoning the waiting ones in. There on the bed, Radhakrishna was looking at them and smiling. Amazingly, the stiffness of his death had vanished, and his natural color was returning. Baba went over, stroked the patient's head, and said to him, "Talk to them. They are worried." "Why are you worried?" asked the perplexed Radhakrishna. I am right. I am all right. I am all right. You are here." Oh my gosh. "I am all right. You are here." Sorry. Swami turned to his wife. "I have given you your husband back to you," he said. "Now get him a hot drink." So, yeah. I mean, that's a testimony written down And this is like one of many, and people you can still talk to today who experience like miracles, and some of them are those sleight of hand miracles, but there are people who experience these, resurrections and these miracles from Sathya Sai Baba.
I mean,
What
if
do
it
you
was a
say to that?
raising from the dead, I mean, I would want to know a little bit more details. Was there like, what were they confirmed dead, or different things like that? I don't know. Like, I would just want to know more details. I would want to know more about it. How do they know that they were dead? That kind of thing. Was there a doctor? Were they confirmed dead? Who are these people? And why should I think that they're telling the truth? The things with like watches and different things like that, that's a little bit easier because it's obviously Sathya Sai Baba was like, when he was dead, like they went into his room, there was like gold bars and all kinds of like money stashed into his room and different things like that.
Mm.
Obviously, he seemed like a pretty self-serving guy, doing trivial little things like that. Now, a resurrection from the dead, no, that's not trivial. That's a little bit more outstanding. I would just need to know more details, I guess. I would just say, okay, that's possible. I'm not going to necessarily rule it out. I just would like to know more. And so
Mm.
I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm not saying that it did happen. I'm not dismissing it just strictly on theological grounds. I just would like to know more. Just like I think a skeptic would, like yourself,
Yeah,
David, would want more details.
yeah.
Like, who are these people? Who is telling me
Mm.
this? How do they know that he was dead? And so on and so forth. And so without those details, I don't know. But it is more interesting than him pulling a watch out of his sleeve or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
And you should go watch his like stuff on YouTube. It's hilarious. He does like he'll have like nothing in his hand and he'll be like, whoa, and then like a gold chain will
Yeah.
come out. And it's
Yeah.
so mundane that he does it. Like he's just going through the crowd just doing it. And everyone's like, oh, he's making gold appear. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's bad.
So I look at that and I turn to Daddy Hume. I turn to Hume and I say, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its
Sure.
falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. We must always decide to favor the lesser miracle. And I saw your video, and I'll just post this in the chat because it is my favorite quote. But I saw your video on David Hume, and I appreciate it. I liked it. I thought it had some good criticisms. However, I don't actually see an issue with it. With how I view what David Hume says. A lot of people argue about David Hume a lot. They talk about like his argument against like using the stable order of nature. Just to me, that's not the part that was amazing for me with David Hume. And I think
Mhm.
like I could even see some criticisms there being valid, that we shouldn't just take what David Hume said there and then say, well, nature says that miracles never happen, therefore miracles never happen. I think that's silly, and I don't think that's what David Hume was really saying. But I'm not a Humean philosopher or anything. But what I will say is it seems very much like that in this situation is it's like, what's more likely, that someone was mistaken, that like you said, like that this person was dead, wasn't dead, or someone's making up a story, or
Sure.
the story's been adapted over the years, or it's something else going on, or that Sathya Sai Baba, the guy that we know he's running this miracles scheme, is creating these is actually healing people, and he prophesied his death and then he didn't come back when he said he was going to come back, and all those things. So but then I guess we both would agree there, but I guess where I then extend that to Christianity as well, and just hear me out for a second. So I look at Christianity. We have numerous stories of apocalyptic preachers in first century Palestine. We have numerous stories of dying and rising gods all through history in different countries and different places. We have thousands of God that cannot be verified but require faith. And we have billions of people who believe in separate deities even unto death. So think of 9/11, think of the early apostles. The people who flew themselves into buildings, they had more faith than 99% of the Christians and Muslims that exist. They truly believed they were going to a better place. And so I look at it and I go, is it more likely that Christianity is another phenomenon of religious conviction, as valid in describing objective reality as every other belief system that I mentioned, or that Christianity is actually the one true interpretation of the universe? And I look at it and I go, I don't see Christianity being that much more valid. I don't see why we can't take Hume's criteria with the stories about Jesus and than we can with everything else.
Sure. Well, I would just say that any kind of like initial prejudice against miracles, any reason that we would want to assign like a low probability of miracles, can't be greater than the rational prejudice, great or small, against the conjunction of two claims that there is possibly a God, that atheism could at least conceivably be false, and that if there is such a God, that he wants to possibly, he has like destined us for some sort of an afterlife, and he has some sort of an important message in order to tell us that there is an afterlife, right? And I don't think that if there is such a revelation, well, then the prior probability of a miracle happening can't be zero, okay? And so, because anybody can come and say, hey, look, listen to me, I'm a prophet, follow me like Muhammad. But then when people say, hey, work a miracle, prove it to us, he's like, I'm just a warner. Okay, guys, I'm not going to do anything. So in order to separate some apocalyptic preacher from somebody who's actually telling you the truth, it does need to be verified by a miracle. Now, that doesn't mean that we should just accept miracle claims on bad evidence. We should require more evidence for miracles. I'm not even in principally against the whole kind of slogan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as long as you define what extraordinary evidence looks like, right? And in Hume's case, it seems to me like he's saying testimony ain't it. Testimony will never be enough. Human testimony is never going to be enough because people lie and people make mistakes. Therefore,
surely you agree with that, though, right? You have to agree with that.
No, I think enough testimony absolutely can overcome the prior probability of a miracle. And this just takes account. This just go ahead.
But like even someone being mistaken, like even with the case with the early Christianity, we're not just basing it off their testimonies, we're basing it off the actions that they took. You know, they went unto death to preach the gospel, and that's not just their testimony. That would be more evidence that what they're saying, they believe what they were saying.
It's the content of their testimony that would make the difference. And so if the gospels do reflect the unembellished testimony that goes back to the apostles, which they touched Jesus, they handled Jesus, they saw him after he died, like really saw him, not brief seeing, not we don't know what kind of seeing, but they spent 40 days with him, ate meals with him, touched his wounds, saw him in groups, then that would be strong evidence. So for example, I think to kind of show why I think Hume is wrong here, if say I were to go to Skepticon with my friend Caleb from church, who has one arm, okay, I hope he's not watching and it's like, hey buddy, why are you picking on me? And his mom came with, and she can testify that's the way that he was born. And I you know, I'm sure people in the chat are like, well, why don't you do it, hot shot? But say I go to Skepticon with my buddy Caleb, he's got one arm, his mom can testify that. And I anoint his head with oil, and I grab the stumpy hand that he has for an arm on the right side, and I say, grow in the name of Jesus Christ. And 5 people at Skepticon see it. Daddy Dillahunty himself is there. He sees it. Okay. He converts. He gives up his positions or whatever. He deletes his YouTube channel. I don't know. And 5 other people there saw it. But all we have is their testimony. There was no photos. There was no video cameras. There was just those 5 guys' testimony. I would think that their testimony would be enough evidence to overcome the low prior probability. Now you might say, well, obviously, Eric, you don't have that for Christianity. Okay, fine. I'm just using this as an illustration that enough testimony, enough powerful testimony of detailed testimony can overcome a prior low
Yeah,
probability.
if you've got, well, it would be even more if, like you said, Daddy Dillahunty, if he had if he was to give up his whole, like, he would give up his Patreon subscriptions and everything because he makes content on atheism, and just delete everything, and because he saw this thing, that could be something. But again, 5 testimonies, I don't think that's sufficient to establish, like, it might be sufficient to establish um that they saw something, but it's not sufficient to establish that a miracle actually occurred. If you had like medical records, like beforehand and afterwards, and we could I don't know, do DNA sequencing to make sure it's the same person, it's not like a twin or something.
Sure.
There's a lot of things that you could do under scientific examination, or even just
Well,
filming it or
let's
something.
just push back on that and just say it's 100 years from now when people are looking at this particular story. I
Yeah,
think
I don't
I
think
think
you.
it should move the needle for somebody. I think that they should at least. I'm
Well, then
not
how
saying
do
that they should
you?
just. I'm not saying they should just believe it. Just okay, that's it. I heard that story. That's enough for me. I think that at that point they should seriously investigate it. I think that they should at least really, really look into it. I don't think they should do the Hume thing and go, no, they're probably mistaken. It probably was something else. I think they should really look into the story and see what
But
evidence.
what? But like, how then do you dismiss all the stories of other religions? Like, how do you dismiss Sathya Sai Baba, or the stories of the Buddha, or this, how do you
Well,
dismiss
sure.
all those things?
Yeah, I'm not dismissing them necessarily. I'm just saying
Okay.
that I haven't been presented evidence sufficient enough to besides the story you gave me is at least intriguing. It's more intriguing than any other Sai Baba story because I've seen we already but at the same time our head is going to go, okay, we already know what kind of a person this guy is.
Mm.
He was accused of being a sex predator. I think he ended up like paying like lawsuits like where it's kind of like the hush money kind of thing where it's not like it was proven. It's not like he was found guilty. But why are you paying people? What does that look like? We already know
Mm.
on camera he's doing magic tricks and goofy stuff like that. And so I think that does kind of lower our expectations on that.
Mm.
But yeah, like take for example, Apollonius of Tiana. Okay, like this is one that like Bart Ehrman likes to bring up, and he brought it up with the debate with Justin Bass, like very briefly. Well, the Philostratus, his biographer, was writing 100 years later, and supposedly the miracles that Apollonius did were like in India or other places far away from where Philostratus was writing, and so that's distance in not just like where the events occurred, but
Can,
also in time. So
can you give me some
that to me,
context about? I don't know who this who this person
yeah,
is.
he was known as like a wonder worker. I think he was like a Greek philosopher. Um, he was supposedly casting out demons and healing the sick. I think he raised the dead. There's other kind of weird, spooky things that he did. I don't remember exactly all of the details, but like off the bat, when we hear of an event that's hundreds of years later, you know, and it's far, far away, we're gonna go, okay, yeah, sure, like whatever. And so like if I said, well, yeah, I healed the sick, and you're like, oh, really? Cool. Where? In the bush in Africa, like you'd be like,
There's
okay.
so many people I know who, like, I know people who said that they know someone who has raised someone from the dead, and it's always unverifiable over in
Yeah.
Thailand or something like that.
So I think
Um,
you're reasonable in being like, I don't think so.
Yeah, well,
Being
and I
skeptical.
mean, we could have a whole other conversation about why some miracles happen, why other miracles don't happen. Why, it's funny. I had lunch with a I used to be a game developer, an indie game developer, and I had lunch with one of my students who, because used to teach it, and one of my students came over from Canada, and he was like, "Oh, I'm in Coolum, let's go." And I'm like, "Cool, I'm in Coolum, let's have a beer." And we ended up talking about God the whole time. And he was a Calvinist. I didn't know this until we sat down, and I didn't know what Calvinism was, but he explained it to me. And I said, how can you deny this evidence of miracles? And he said to me, I can't, because, oh, well, first of all, I said it seemed disgusting it seemed like an idea of a cruel God to create someone who was just destined to go to hell, which is what he told me he believed.
Sure.
And then and I was like, that why create someone in the first place? But then and he said, yeah, sure. And he's like, I can see that. And then I was like, and then he's like, but I think it's disgusting that you believe in miracles. And I was like, why? And he's like, because how can you believe in miracles and then not be outside of a children's hospital every single second of every day, healing every person that goes in there? And secondly, why do some miracles work and some miracles don't work? Like, why is that the case?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I do find it strange when like Reformed people or maybe more conservative theologically people say that, when it's like, well, Jesus didn't heal every single person, right? I mean, he even tells the story in his own hometown, and he's like, hey, I know what you're going to say, physician, heal yourself. And he's like, but like, hey, Elisha only healed Naaman the Syrian. So then he just kind of was like, so chew on that. And they, according to the story, wanted to push him off the brow of the cliff after that. He only healed one paralytic when he, in John chapter 5, when he went through the pool of Bethesda, when there was a bunch of paralytics. And so there's different reasons. Some of it is just God's providence, but I'm not a Calvinist. I would say that there's less suffering and evil in the world if he's healing somebody versus nobody. I would think even a lot of Calvinists would say that God can and still does heal certain people. I mean, Jeff Durbin's, who's like the Calvinist of Calvinists, and I think he's even a cessationist, like believes that his adopted son was healed of spinal bifida. People can look that up on YouTube if they're interested. And so now that one's kind of hard to verify because they were doing all these tests while the mother was pregnant. And so I understand if there's some skepticism about that one. But yeah, that's a theological question that just kind of goes back to the problem of evil. You could be the wildest Pentecostal faith healer. Nobody is going to believe that you can go empty out a hospital, because Jesus himself didn't do that. It even says in his own hometown, he could do no mighty work except heal a few sick folk. So it's not like,
yeah, because what does it say? I heard
because of their unbelief. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we do see often that when Jesus did heal, it was in response to faith. The woman with the issue of blood, he turned to her and said, daughter, thy faith has healed you. The centurion servant said, hey, go, as you believe.
Could we substitute the word? Could we substitute the word believe, faith there for placebo effect?
I mean, it depends on what the situation is. Again, I don't think that placebo effect explains some of the healings and miracles that we.
Yeah, I don't think so. But it would explain so much. Like the placebo effect or spontaneous remission would explain a lot of the stuff that a lot of the hardcore miracles we do see. But there's always that question: why doesn't God heal amputees? Why do they have
sure. Well, there is an amputee I believe that God has healed, but it's one that some of your audience might.
Smith Wigglesworth?
No, not Smith Wigglesworth. the man, the myth, the legend. That guy's the Pentecostal Jim Bunyan there. But I'm not saying that what he did was real or not real. I can't verify it. But what I do know is there's a man by the name of Bruce Van Natta who was working under a car in Wisconsin. You can look up his story. I have a video about him on my channel. He testifies of it himself at several places on YouTube, where he was working under a giant semi truck, and it fell right on his stomach. Blood shot up through his mouth. He started to have an out-of-body experience. He described that angels were holding his body together. The doctor said that they have never seen anybody with that much, I think, blood loss and like that kind of trauma survive. He survived for 90 minutes. He should have been instantly killed, basically. They had to cut away the majority of his intestine. He had basically 3/4 of the amount of a human intestine left. He was placed on he had to be fed through like drip feeding, through an IV. And even that he couldn't digest well because he would just have diarrhea because he didn't have enough intestine to properly digest his food. He had a friend in New York while he was in the situation. After months later, he went from like 180 to 120 pounds. He was basically just kind of circling the drain. He had a friend who said that he believed God spoke to him. He got on a plane from New York to Wisconsin. He laid hands on Bruce. Bruce said that he testified that he felt like an electricity going to his body. He began to resume eating a normal diet. He began to gain weight. He was not having diarrhea anymore. He was examined by a doctor, and yes, intestines cannot be, unless they pull out his intestines and measure them, they can't be. But all the imaging they show says that most of his intestine has regrown. Okay. So that's as close to an amputee story as I have. I think that's a pretty credible story, and he's normal ever since. He still has scars to prove it.
Would you say that's evidence for the healing power of your perspective, your like Christianity?
Well, yeah. I mean, the man prayed for him in the name of Jesus. I mean, so the context was they're both Christian believers. He invoked the name of Jesus for the man's healing, and then his intestines basically regrew. He's living a normal life. Everything is fine now with him. And from what we see, spontaneous remission or placebo is just out the window here.
What about if that was the exact same scenario but for a different religion? Would that be evidence of that religion?
Yeah, I think we would need to look at that religion, or we would need to update our theological beliefs, like maybe a universalistic God or some kind of a John Hick kind of God. He was kind of like, hey, they're all kind of always to God. Yeah, we would need to update our theology at that point, but I would say that's evidence for theism versus the opposite.
Yeah, you seem more reasonable than not to the most apologists, to be honest. I feel like that was a question that could have got us into a loop. So I appreciate you being honest. So when and not to crap on all apologists or whatever, I'm sure that I'm not perfect, no one's perfect, but it seems like I'm just thinking of like the Ken Hams and the Ken Hovens and things like that.
Oh, I get crapped on all the time. It's okay.
No, I'm not, and you will, like, people I can see in the comments, like, people are a lot of people who have left their faith will be quite sensitive to stories like this and immediately be on their back feet or be kind of aggressive towards this because like leaving your faith when it's such a strong part of your life is like really kind of can be very traumatic. For me, it was
for sure.
one of the most traumatic but beautiful, like the scariest but beautiful moments of my life, and the saddest but most beautiful parts of my life as well. But you definitely get that reaction, and it gets so I wouldn't take it I always talk to Michael Jones about this. We're friends, and and he's always like, why do these people hate me? And I was like, well, for Michael Jones, there's different reasons. He makes
the TikToks, man. It's the TikToks.
I think what it is, it's I said to him, I was like, you make videos like slamming other perspectives, and you do a really good job of it, but then that irks people because they think your perspective is stupid. So it's like watching I don't know. Anyway, we won't talk about Michael too much, but
I'm guilty of the same thing that he is.
Yeah.
And me and Michael are friends as well. So yeah,
he's a good guy. He's good and funny. Like I always talk about this. Every time he comes on, he drinks whiskey. So I've got the Christian apologist drinking whiskey, and then I've asked. I don't think he's ever going to come on. But when I was planning to have a Satanist on, the head brother of the Temple of Noosa, Satan Temple, he's like, we're having tea and scones. I'm going to bake the most delicious pumpkin scones, and we're going to have tea and scones. So look at the Satanist having tea and scones, and then the Christian apologist drinking straight whiskey. So just I know that we've and get your questions in, people. I've got a couple starred, but I might have missed some. So if you've definitely want me to read them out, either super chat them or I'll try and get to them. But when we look at the Gospels, something that I find that's super interesting is you build this kind of cumulative case. But something that I look at when I look at the Gospels is, do you hold to Markian priority, where Mark was written first?
I don't care. It's kind of weird. I'm very ambivalent. I think there's probably more going for Mark in priority than Matthew in priority. My friend David Paulman might get mad at me. I've shared several of his videos where he argues for Matthew in priority. I'm willing to be convinced either way. At this point, I think I'm glad that he's tackling it because it's a very neglected issue in the discussion. But at the end of the day, I really don't care as long as there's reliability for the Gospels. And I think
Yeah.
that there's marks of independence. I know this is people are like, well, it's just Mark, and then maybe another source, Q, and people embellishing all kinds of things. And then John just comes out of left field and just says all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And I push back on all of that on my channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and you definitely do, and I think some of your videos are awesome. Not that I don't agree with a lot of your conclusions, but I definitely appreciate the way you engage with the arguments. So when I look at, for me, I build a cumulative case, but I build it the other way than you do. Like I look at Mark and I go, okay, there's no virgin birth. There's no genealogies, there's no infancy narratives, no Sermon on the Mount, or the Lord's Prayer, or parables, or the Beatitudes. And funny, the Beatitudes were, there's a version of the Beatitudes in the Dead Sea Scrolls written prior to Jesus' time, 4Q Beatitudes. It's not word for word, but it's the same structure. It's like 8 blessed are statements and then a longer ninth blessed statement. There's the I am statements in John that are not in Mark. The Logos word concept is not in Mark. The Last Supper discourses are not in Mark. Doubting Thomas and
it's kind of in Mark. Last Supper's in Mark.
The last sorry, the
You're talking about
Supper
like those
discourses.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
17 through 13 through 17.
Yes. Yeah. So and then doubting Thomas, and then expanding post resurrection appearances. We don't have any of that in Mark. And if you take to Mark in priority and you believe that Mark was written first, and then it took 15 years or so for these other things to be written, like I don't know if it's 1520 or like how I forgot how long it is exactly. I think Mark was written 40 years after Jesus died, and
I subscribe to earlier dating than that. There's a good book by Jonathan Bernier that I recommend on the dating of the Gospels, but we could grant, for the sake of argument, 40 years, sure.
Okay. And but then how long between Mark and the next Gospel? Like
5, 10, 15 tops.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought it was like 15, 20. But anyway,
maybe 10, 15. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in that 10 years, which is a long time, like 10 years ago, I was still a Christian. 10 years ago, 10 years ago, 2013. Yeah, I wonder what I was just, I was only a couple of years. I was only a couple of years since being a youth pastor, or a year since being a youth pastor. I was, so 10 years is a long time. But you've got like all these things that are like, I just don't know why Mark didn't include the virgin birth and the resurrection, the disciples' encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Sure. It ends abruptly at the empty tomb. Like, if you were to think of the Gospels as as recounting the life of Jesus, and you don't have this like 30,000 feet view, you just have the perspective of Mark. Why did Mark leave out all these important things? And it seems very clear, a cumulative case seems very clear, that the other Gospels are adding to it. They're adding to the stories, and then they're adding things that are known in the Dead Sea Scrolls from prior, that are not obviously not words of Jesus directly, or at least Jesus would be using it something in the time. And then we have that Jesus was supposed to come back in his disciples' lifetime. And the only way you can get around that is if you translate what Jesus said there to be the exact opposite of what Jesus said. So it's, I tell you the truth, people standing here will not taste death until all these things happen. Becomes, I tell you the truth, everyone here will taste death until all these things happen. Or, I tell you this truth, this generation will not pass away until they see the Son of Man returning on the clouds. Becomes, I tell you the truth, this generation is long and gone, and 2,000 years later, we're still waiting for the Son of Man to return on the clouds. Yeah. Like, how do you? I build a cumulative case and I go, this just doesn't work.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to address there, and so
in the last 5 minutes, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. So I will talk about some resources and try and give some really quick responses.
Yeah.
There. And so, as far as the words of Jesus regarding the second coming and different things like that, was he a false apocalyptic prophet? I would refer people to my friend Michael's 3 video series. And I will go ahead and refer people to Matthew Hartke and Derek Lambert's response on their channel, and they can make up their minds as far as that goes. Is one interpretation is given, and that would be through Michael. I would also refer people to, although I'm not what I would a Craig bot, just everything that Daddy William Lane Craig says is good and gold. He does have a very good 3-part underrated series where he talks about the delay of the Perusia. It's just for his defenders class, so they could just look up those resources. Delay of Perusia. There are some textual things there that are going on that I don't really think people are interpreting Jesus correctly, and I think he has some very cogent explanations there. I would like to make a video on that, just not to just parrot him necessarily because he's already done it, but just nobody's watched those videos compared to his like debates and different things like that. So I might, kind of try and reproduce those and point people his direction. So I know it's kind of a non-answer, just, look at the footnotes kind of answer there, but that's what I got right now for that. As far as the other things, like with Mark, well, why didn't he mention the virgin birth or some of these other different things? I mean, we could also ask why Grafton's Chronicles doesn't mention the reign of King John, or he mentions the reign of King John, but he never mentions the Magna Carta, the Civil War General U.S. Grant. He was Lincoln's general for the Civil War. He doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation. He kept an extensive diary of the war throughout, right? In the detailed biography of Constantine, Eusebius never mentions the death of Constantine's son Crispus and his wife Fausta. Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Josephus and Philo never mention it. We only get it in the book of Acts. And then 100 years later, Suetonius. And so we have to kind of be careful with making arguments from silence. I do understand, I'm not saying that all arguments from silence are bad necessarily, but they are pretty precarious. And so what I would say is, yeah, we can consider that, but then we need to look at kind of the internal and external evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Do they show that they were close up to the facts? Do they show that they are knowledgeable? Do they look like they're honest people who are trying to get it right? And if we have those things, and I believe that we do on a number of different grounds, which is what my channel is all about, then I think we have reason to trust them. Also, with the ending of Mark, a lot of scholars believe that it was actually cut off abruptly, and we don't have the lost ending. Gar is the Greek word where it ends. It's the only, I believe, I could be wrong, somebody can correct me, it's the only Greek text that we have from 200 years before and after the Gospels where a text ends on that particular verb. Many scholars like Bruce Metzger and others believe that ending was just actually lost. And so that's why somebody felt like they had to come in and fill it in with the longer ending of Mark.
Okay. Have you got a couple minutes for some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Guys, go check out Testify's channel. Awesome stuff there. And I remember you did a video on one of Derek's videos. Like, you did a video responding to one of Derek's videos. So I was like, hey, I edited that for Derek. And yeah. And of course, guys, in a couple of days we have should we deplatform harmful ideologies? Chrissy is someone who called me out on Twitter, and we got into an hour and a half long conversation, and we ended up becoming buddies by the end, and now we're going to talk about it. And then we're going to have Dr. Dan McClellan coming on. I'll talk about the first God, monotheism, and that's going to be an exciting one. If you want to support the channel, Patreon or join and super chat, they're all always appreciated. But thank you everyone for all your support, really appreciate it. So we have some comments. I'm just going to get this one out. This one is quite brutal, but I think it needs to be. Truth said, my sister was raped and she pleaded with Jesus to help her. Why didn't he? You guys, you say the guys in Teston's group, but why not my sister? I mean, that's a hard question.
That's a hard question.
And I'm very sorry, Truth, that your sister went through that.
Well, yeah, obviously. And so, I mean, that's tough. Why did some of my friends get abused? Why did I grow up in a crazy home, even though I pleaded to God while I felt like I was being neglected by my parents, and they were too busy getting drunk to pay attention to me. Again, I'm not trying to make them look bad. They just, thankfully, they're sober now.
Yeah.
Rape
You
is
want to get that long
obviously
life. You want to
rape.
get that long life, right?
Yeah, rape is
The-
obviously 1,000 times worse than anything that I've experienced. And so, I mean, that just, if a miracle happens, there's less evil in the world than there is not. It's more evidence for theism than there's not. You might question the justice of God at that point, but it would be difficult to question his existence. But I also believe in a God, and this is what I think Christianity has going for it more than, say, the Muslim view, or is that this God became incarnate, was tied to a pillar and beaten bloody, and was spit upon, had a crown of thorns put on his head, had nails driven through his hands and feet, and suffocated to death, excruciating pain for hours. And so he's a God who can sympathize with our sufferings, and he suffers with us. But of course, that's awful. And I think that anything that I'm saying here, to be honest, is going to sound hollow and like a pat answer. And so in those kind of situations, what possibly can you say? I think we've all known people.
Yeah, and you're right. And truth, it's absolutely horrible that your sister went through that. That seems to be the I encourage anyone to go listen to the conversation I had with Michael Jones on the problem of evil, and the problem of suffering. I think Michael's perspective on that, it makes sense, but it's definitely not a God that I would even. I don't even think he believes. Like, I don't think he fully grasps like what he was saying there. Like, it just seems very. I don't know. The problem of evil is a big one. It just seems very. It's probably the biggest problem to monotheistic religions, I would say.
It is. I mean, there's Corrie ten Boom. I mean, was a Christian woman who was dragged off into concentration camps and, stripped in front of men while they were doing things. And, it's just.
Even in Anne Frank's diary, she wrote. I mean, I think she was just Jewish though, but
Sure.
she wrote that. We pray to God every night, and I know that He won't forsake us. And I remember looking at that and thinking, He did. Like, He kept the gates of Auschwitz locked. And it's like and I know this would be very harsh hearing this, but like my wife and I had people invite us to a prayer meeting because they heard a prophetic voice tell them, or they heard a prophet say that someone needed to come and get healed of endometriosis the next week, someone's sister. And that was we got invited by my wife's sister, and my wife had endometriosis. And I thought to myself, like, if God can heal, use His powers to heal Amy of endometriosis, like, don't. Like, we can go through the medical system, we can get that cleared up with science, and go save the little girl that's going to be raped. Go stop the boy that's getting beaten by his father. Go, the starving family in Africa, or go help them. Sure. Like, don't waste the power on me if there's a limited amount.
There's one thing that I will say, it's just as a resource. Greg Boyd. I'm not an open theist as he is, but I don't hold to a view of meticulous providence, which is where God is literally controlling everything. I know maybe someone might say, well, that doesn't help because He's still allowing things. But there's a book that he's written on the topic, Greg Boyd, Satan and the Problem of Evil. And there's a shorter version, and I wish I could remember the name of it. But it's worth checking out. He's really kind of thought of these things from both an emotional standpoint, a philosophical standpoint. And I think his voice kind of in this topic, I kind of more agree with his kind of warfare worldview kind of thesis on it. Is God to blame beyond the problem of bad answers for suffering? And so people can maybe check that out if they're kind of struggling with that question, because the whole idea of God's controlling everything, like even the person that's raping somebody. Like, I don't subscribe to that at all. Like a Calvinist would. Sorry, Calvinist, if you're watching, but I don't.
Well, Carrie Ann actually points out too, there is no sympathy for victims of rape in the Bible, just sympathy for the financial hit the father/owner will face having a damaged product.
As far as like stuff like that goes, yeah, like when you look at the Old Testament.
I'm sorry to be rape heavy. We'll leave on the rape comments after this.
These are the brutal ones, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And it's like, here I am, whatever. But when Jesus talks about like the divorce laws in Matthew chapter 19, and somebody, like, I think it's like the teachers of the law come up and they're like, or maybe it's even his disciples, I can't remember, but he's like, hey, can we get a divorce for any reason? Well, back then it was just like a man could just no fault divorce a woman because he just, depending on how he interpreted Moses, and a woman couldn't. And she wouldn't be provided for, really. It was just like, there you go, you've been divorced, now you kind of got this black mark on you, and your protection, your provision, all of that stuff, you're on your own. And I mean, that's terrible, right? That's terrible. And so Jesus says, he points people to the creational order, and he said Moses permitted this, but I'm telling you, this is the way that it is. You're married for life. And he said in the beginning it was not so. And he points back to the creational order of things. So in the creational order of things, in the Edenic picture, and people might not like this or whatever, they might think I'm doing mental gymnastics, fine, whatever. But in the creational order of things, the way God created things before the fall, there wasn't slaves, and there wasn't divorce, there wasn't all of this kind of crazy stuff. That's the picture that he's trying to point people to. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Okay, that's the kind of kingdom that he's trying to bring into. That's why he's saying Moses said this, but I'm giving you like much stricter criteria here. And so these were people who were unregenerate, that only had the law. The law was showing them that they're evil. And it's the power of the Holy Spirit that ultimately changed men's hearts. And the world that we've inherited, as I think Michael has done a good job arguing, and others as well, is basically a Christianized world. We're living on Christian capital. This is what Tom Holland argues so well in his book Dominion. These concepts of these things are wrong. I'm not trying to sound like a pre-supper here, but they do, if you read Tom Holland's book, they do come out of it. And Tom Holland is an atheist, by the way. They do come from a Christian ethic that has been pushing a lot of these things. So it's a great question. It's a difficult question. I'm probably not giving the most satisfactory answer, but that's
solve the problem of evil.
Yeah. Boom. 2 minutes. Let me tweet it out.
Yeah.
It's done.
Yeah. Guitar Dog said only Matthew has the zombie parade.
And again,
I don't think it's technically zombies, right? It's not.
Yeah. I have a video.
Technically zombies that have to be created with black magic. These would just be rising saints, like,
yeah,
but they're technically zombies. They're not technically zombies, but they appear like zombies, I guess.
We're not told how many there are. We're only told by Matthew.
Do you think it's true?
It's brief. Yeah, I don't hold the Lacona view of like, well, it's just apocalyptic window dressing kind of. I think it happened. Okay. I think that my reasons for that are routed through reliability of Matthew's gospel. If I have a lot of different reasons to trust Matthew, when he tells me something that's a little bit weird and I can't confirm, but he's reliable about a lot of other things, then I have reason to trust it. But would I use that? Does that miracle fall on my criteria? No. Like the stuff that we were talking about earlier, I think you can, as a skeptic, rationally doubt it. And I think it's when you come into the examination of the Gospels and go, okay, these guys are just constantly telling the truth. They're constantly getting it right. They're constantly showing themselves to be reliable. We're talking about a handful of saints. We're not talking about like 10,000 legions of guys walking into Jerusalem and appearing to everybody. We don't know how many it was. It could have just been a small group of people that just went and visited a relative. They could have been earlier followers of Jesus. They're going to another relative saying, hey, and it raises the prior probability when they hear the news of the resurrection, like, oh, wow, maybe that did happen because I've heard this story, or I had this relative appear to me, or whatever. I don't know. Yes, it's a weird story. It's a super weird story. But again, we want to be careful with the argument from silence.
Thank you, Eddie Dean, for the $2 super chat. Testify, did Noah's flood happen?
I'm not a super big Old Testament guy. I think it did happen. I think it was local. I don't believe in a global flood. I'm not a young Earth creationist. That might disappoint some people, but I think it was probably on a local level. I'm not a huge BioLogos guy, but they do have some interesting articles on the flood, biologos.com, that people could check out there, that argue for it being a local flood, that are just super easy, quick reads that I think are digestible.
Yeah. Well, the only problem with that though is it defeats the purpose of the flood in the first place, right? Which is to wipe out everything.
Yeah, I understand that. There's different ways that people interpret some of the words and different things like that. It's not something that I've looked super deeply into, so I
I,
just
I, I
I,
think that you would really like the well, I don't know if you would, but there's a Dr. Josh talks about how there's this theory that it's a polemic against Mesopotamian society. So like the story of Noah is, taken from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's rewritten as the Hebrew story. If you look at like the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, like it's all pointing towards civilization, like it's all pointing towards Mesopotamian society is like, I think it's like, I'm going to get it wrong, but like Enkidu is a forest man and he drinks beer, but it's all moving towards Mesopotamian society. And then with the Abrahamic story, it's moving away. That you got the Tower of Babel, and it's like, and he goes around in tents for the rest of his life. And there's actually this idea that the stories written about it in Genesis there were a retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but in a way that's like taking what God really wants and like showing what God really wants. I'm doing a video on it soon. For the patrons, for the Patreon supporters, we'll have a interview with a private interview with Dr. Josh, and then from that I'll make the clips. So just last couple of quick questions. Absurd scandal. Did the youth who prayed over you literally tell you info that they couldn't have known naturally? No, they definitely could have known naturally. It was stuff like, I know that you're feeling like XYZ, but God wants you to tell you ABC. And the ABC made me feel a lot better. And the XYZ, they probably knew about because they were out the front praying for me. And the girls had invited me to a youth group would have said things like, he's depressed. He's an angry kid at school. He always walks around with his headphones in, listening to Eminem or Marilyn Manson or something. So this guy needs prayer, blah, 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 blah. And they would have told him all this stuff. And they probably would have spoken about me for weeks prior to that because they were trying to get me to go along and they were in the leadership. So it's very likely that I think that these people knew about me and they were taking the step of faith, and having all these people pray for you that were my age, that were clearly nervous about doing so, and they're telling me things that really hit home for me. It was something special. So what do you think of when Pragmatic Crystal says any god who takes payment in blood is not worthy of worship? I mean, you disagree, but what do you think about the problem of blood sacrifice being disgusting, or not disgusting, but like immoral?
Like the atonement? I mean,
yeah.
I hold to
like killing animals before Jesus and then killing his son.
Blood sacrifices and different things like that. I don't know. I mean, there's different things for what that symbolizes. Probably stumbling a little bit on that one. I don't hold to like a penal theory or satisfaction theory of atonement. I kind of hold, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I kind of have more of an Eastern view of the atonement, that salvation comes through being a partaker of the divine nature. Jesus says that its death is like a seed that falls into the ground and dies. And if it dies, it brings forth much grain. I think that, yes, the blood does bring atonement. It does bring forgiveness. I can't just ignore those particular passages. But I think the main point is that we could be kind of grafted into him, and that there's that whole vine and branch thing, and that his life flows through us and produces faith and hope and charity and different things like that. That salvation is about being kind of divinized, or becoming, and that sounds very Mormon, but not that kind of divinized, like the Eastern kind of divinized, where you become a partaker of the divine nature, that you become a partaker of God's energies. And for Jesus to become incarnate, he could do what he couldn't do without become incarnate, whereas he would have to learn courage, that he would have to learn trust in the face of adversity. He would have to learn courage in the face of fear. He would have to learn love in the face of his enemies spitting upon him and mocking him. And I believe that, this could sound convoluted to people. I'm just imagining trying to say this to skeptics, but because that's who I'm talking to. But that's the whole point, is he's trying to reproduce that life in us. And the death, like the sacrifice, is like pushes to that. It kind of puts a capstone on it in the sense of like non-resistance in the face of great evil. And that kind of thing. And that's the kind of life that he wants to reproduce in us, is non-resistant love when your enemies are mocking you, spitting on you, crucifying you, and you're still saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I don't know if he could have communicated that otherwise. And I think these sacrifices were types and shadows of that particular sacrifice that would happen in the future. Is it weird? Does it sound kooky? Sure. I'm willing to admit that. Do I fully understand it? No, that's not something that I have totally figured out. And I think with Christianity, I don't think I have to have all of my questions answered necessarily to have cognitive closure. I just need to think that what I believe makes more sense versus the negation. If that makes sense. So sorry if that was word salady.
No,
it's trying to answer as honest as I can.
No, that's fine, and I appreciate that you are honest. And sometimes the honest answers aren't fully, like a lot of people in the comments will be like, "What? This is silly" or whatever. But it's like, well, you're answering honesty, which is, I guess, your opinion, which is fine. I think that's great. Instead of like having like a, I've had anyway. I'm getting distracted. I've got three last questions. Three last questions for you.
Sure.
So, actually, I'm just going to skip two last questions. I'd love to do this again because there's so much more I want to go into it with you. This is obviously you're in the firing seat for this. If you ever want to put me in the firing seat on your channel or another show, I'm happy to come and try and defend my worldview. Obviously, I haven't expressed a huge amount of my worldview here, but there's definitely room where people can prod me because you've been in the hot seat, and so I'd return the favor anytime you'd want to, if you want to. So I'm going to register two questions. First question, and this is a question I ask a lot of people: what, if anything, would change your mind?
What would change my mind if the Gospels were found to be unreliable documents? And some of the modern miracles that I think are well evidenced had a better explanation, a better scientific explanation. I'm not going to be one of these Christians that are like, you got to find the bones of Jesus to disprove it to me. No, I just think if the Gospels are riddled with contradictions and unreliable documents, which plenty of people will say that they are, then that would change my mind. I've looked at the evidence. I've looked at it for a long time. I think it's the opposite. Otherwise, I'd be making a different kind of channel, I guess. So yeah, that would change my mind. I think you should have falsifiability in any worldview. It's important.
Yeah, 100%. What is the most plausibly true religion that you don't believe in?
Plausibly true that I don't believe in? Man, I don't know. Judaism, but that just springs out of Christianity, so that's cheating. Catholicism, because
let's move. If we were to take, you can't do anything.
All Christians,
let's say you had to choose like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Shinto, something very different.
I don't know. I think I would just be like a general theist of some sort. Like I think the John Hick kind of religion would be the one where it's
John Wick or John Hick.
Yeah, no, John. Hey, both. Why not both? That would be pretty killer. No, I would say something like he was kind of like they're all have these elements of truth and they all point to God. Basically, he's kind of like a pluralist. I would say that would make the most sense because he's going to argue that theism is definitely true, but he's going to say that none of them really have the corner on the market, and so it's not really even a religion. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer. I know about Islam. I know about Judaism. I know about Buddhism, but Buddhism is atheistic, really, and so I don't find
No,
anything
there's
there.
some theistic. There are some theistic ideas of Buddhism, like sects of
Yeah,
Buddhism.
yeah. I
They have
know,
a
like,
hell. There's some
yeah,
sects that have a hell, and the hell is kind of cool because it's only temporary. Like you go there to burn up your karma if you couldn't do it
they're
in the
annihilationist or something. Yeah.
yeah yeah. Oh, you end up burning it off and then becoming enlightened. So it's not like
Oh,
it's like if all else fails, if you can't get enlightened in the regress of life or whatever, you eventually go to hell and you burn off your karma there, and then you go to the enlightenment or something,
they're
or you
like
become enlightened.
the universalist one version of it. Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I wish I had a better answer. Something theistic and very general without a whole lot of special revelation, I guess, would be the one that would work. I
Okay.
still think there's good evidence that God exists and that miracles happen today. So it would just have to be some sort of pluralistic, hey, kumbaya, we're all going to heaven kind of God, I guess.
Do you believe in aliens?
I don't think there's any good evidence. I think it's possible because the universe is so vast. I don't have a problem if we discovered there were aliens. I wouldn't feel like my worldview was too threatened. C.S. Lewis certainly didn't see it that way. He wrote books about it, but yeah, I think it's
We're
possible, but
actually
I don't think they visited Earth. I think that kind of journey is impossible for them. And I just think even if say something like abiogenesis really did happen, which I don't think it happened, I do think there are some good arguments for the intelligent design kind of camp for the fact that the origin of life points to theism. But if it did happen, it's almost impossible. And so I wouldn't be shocked at all if we're alone. Even if I was an atheist, I would probably have that view.
Yeah, and it's something that I hadn't thought about too much, the alien thing recently, but we are having, I had someone reach out, we are having Aaron Adair on and his co-author to talk about finding ET. So he actually he worked for SETI, so the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and he's written a book about what would be the sociological and religious impact if we did find ET, if we did find a religious person. And also we're having a comedian come on, Sydney Davis Jr., who is a comedian. She's got a special out and she runs a podcast called Growing Up Fundy. But tell me that it's the most horrifying image. I got an image of VeggieTales and mixed it with an image of Jesus. Tell me that's the most not the most horrifying image you've ever seen ever. That gives me nightmares, and I loved it so much I put it in there. So but yeah,
That's pretty scary.
So
I hope I can sleep tonight.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I think conversations like this, I hope I was respectful enough that you felt comfortable. I love having conversations with Christians and people that I have different opinions of. It's always very special to me, especially when they can be cordial and polite. So thank you so much for coming on, guys. Go check out Testify, even if you don't agree with everything that you heard here. His content's good, and some of his it's if you want someone to, if you want to go and watch a video and try and find ways you can argue against it, and that's what I like to watch your stuff. I go okay, I'll watch this, and I go, I don't really agree with that one part, or I agree with this part, and find the good, find the bad. It's good stuff. So go subscribe to Testify. And with that said, we're going to end today's stream. I'm going to go to work, so I'm super excited for that. What time is it where you are?
It is 5:30.
Oh, yep. Cool.
Yep.
Oh, okay, that's bad. It's 8:30 for me.
Okay.
All right. I'll see you later, and thanks for tuning in. See you guys. Bye.
Yep. Take care.